Here's the JLU Podcast breakdown of Wonder Woman's blockbuster movie structure, based on Blake Snyder's formula as explained in his book, Save the Cat. And Blake Snyder says explicitly that this is not necessarily the formula for all films, because film is an art form where people can take many liberties and try experimental approaches to telling their stories. But film is also a business, and Snyder contends that this formula has been proven to work for blockbuster films that are meant to have general mass market appeal. Wonder Woman definitely showed that mass market appeal, and it also exemplifies a film that infuses creativity within the confines of the formula and demonstrates good execution. First of all, in our interpretation, although Wonder Woman has some elements of the genre that Blake Snyder calls superhero, we think the film is predominantly a rites of passage film. Diana is going through something that is a universal human experience, namely the departure from a protective home and mother, and entry into a big, complex, and dangerous world. She learns some hard truths and has to figure out how to hold on to her ideals and her compassion in the face of violence and hatred out there in the world. Overall, in terms of Snyder's story genres, Wonder Woman is about Diana taking ideas from Themyscira and integrating them, synthesizing them into what she's learned in man's world throughout the movie. And at the end, she arrives as a new person. Next, we'll go through the Blake Snyder beat sheet, but we must first note that Wonder Woman has some extra components, a prologue and an epilogue, the present-day scenes that are set in Paris. So with those being a framing device for the story, we're going to actually look at the main substance of the film as the flashback portion, which gives us roughly 127 minutes of content. Using 127 minutes as the total runtime, Blake Snyder's formula gives specific page numbers for certain things to happen, and we'll compare those formulaic suggestions with the actual film as we go along. Note that one page of script generally corresponds with 1 minute of screen time. Okay, let's go through the formula. We'll first give Blake Snyder's directives, and then we'll remark on Wonder Woman in particular. Opening image. This is a visual that represents the tone of the story, a snapshot of the main character's problem or motivation before the adventure begins. In Wonder Woman, it's an innocent, young Diana looking down at the Amazon warriors, wishing for a chance at adventure and to save mankind, as those warriors did in the past. The suggestion in the formula is for this opening image to happen on page 1, and yes, we see it in the first minute of the film. Theme stated. This is a moment within the setup where a character actually says aloud what your story is about, the message, the truth. Usually it is spoken to the main character, or at least spoken in their presence. But the main character doesn't understand the truth yet, and they won't until they have some personal experience and context to support it. In Wonder Woman, we think some of the themes about the growth that Diana will need to undergo are more implicit and not always said aloud in the setup. But there is one moment where a theme is explicitly stated to Diana, and that's from Hippolyta. She says to Diana, "I will tell you a story so that you will finally understand that war is nothing to hope for." But of course, Diana doesn't learn from the story. She has to go out into the world and learn for herself about war. In our view, this isn't necessarily the most important theme of the movie, but it's definitely a theme, and it's an area of growth for Diana, who goes from the young girl who can't wait to pick up a sword, and then the eager hero trying to seek out Ares as soon as possible, to a more reserved and wise hero who realizes that people have to make choices for themselves. Theme stated is recommended for page 6. In Wonder Woman, it happens a little bit early at minute 3.5, which would be page 4. The setup, an exploration of the main character's world as it is now, with some clear room for growth or something missing. So that would be the sheltered life among the Amazons on Themyscira, and the egalitarian and honorable society that they have. It's also the mother-daughter dynamics, where Diana in the setup is still somewhat naive, though good-hearted. She has some room to grow, becoming an adult and having for herself some of the experiences and wisdom that her mother already has. The history lesson with Ares' relationship to mankind is also part of the setup. Suggested, pages 1 through 14. In the film, it's minutes 1 through 13. The catalyst. This is the moment where life as it is changes, and it's an event that starts to propel the main plot forward. So of course, this is Steve Trevor's crash, and the arrival of not only a man on Themyscira, but the arrival of the Germans and the troubles of mankind. According to the formula, the catalyst is supposed to occur on page 14. And right on cue, the plane crash starts at 13 minutes 40 seconds, which would be page 14 of the script. Now, the catalyst is usually just a moment, but Wonder Woman extends the catalyst by putting in a whole action sequence on the beach before the debate. This is a section where the main character has to think about the big plunge that they're about to make before they head off on the main plot. Change is scary, and for a moment the main character doubts the journey they must take. Can I face this challenge? During the debate section of the story, the main character could still back out. In Wonder Woman, there's no question that Diana wants to go, but there is debate about whether she actually can and will go. There's debate between Diana and Hippolyta, and Steve is part of the debate too, because he warns them about the war. Another key part here is Diana and Steve in the infirmary, which does help Diana make the decision to take the leap.
My father told me once, he said, if you see something wrong happening in the world, you can either do nothing or you can do something. And I already tried nothing.
And that leap is represented in Diana scaling the tower and taking the sword and armor. The final bit of debate is Hippolyta and Diana at night, right before she leaves. Diana concludes by saying that she must do something, but we can see that this is a very emotional moment for her. This debate section is supposed to take up pages 14 through 29, and in the film it's pretty close, just nudged later a bit because of the extended catalyst scene on the beach. So the debate is actually minutes 18 through 33. Break into Act 2. The main character makes a choice and the journey begins. We leave the original status quo and go into the upside-down world that is Act 2. So the world of Act 1 is Themyscira, and the contrasting world of Act 2 is man's world. So the break into Act 2, the moment where there's no turning back now, is Diana getting on the sailboat with Steve. And Hippolyta literally says to her that she can't come back. The formula lists this on page 29, and it happens at minute 33. B story. Now the B story is something that is woven throughout the film, but the Blockbuster formula says that the start of Act 2 is a specific place where you're supposed to develop the B story. The B story is usually called the love story, and this part of it is usually a discussion between the main character and the love interest. Moreover, the discussion should touch on the theme from Theme Stated. In Wonder Woman, the break into 2 leads right to the sailboat conversation between Diana and Steve. From earlier, one of the themes is that war is not something to hope for. And here, they do talk about just that. Diana is eager to get to Ares, and she is very confident that she'll destroy him, but Steve is trying to tell her about the extent of the war and its true horrors. Of course, she'll have to see it for herself before she can fully realize the theme. This is supposed to happen around page 35, and we see it in the movie around minute 36. Fun and games. This is when the main character explores the new world and the audience is entertained by the premise they have been promised. The premise for Wonder Woman is pretty clear. A superpowered hero from an island of only women comes to man's world in the era of World War I. So the audience has been promised some culture clash moments and some time period set pieces. The fun and games begin right after the theme discussed on the sailboat. Diana and Steve's banter about marriage and sex is part of the fun and games we were promised. So is her arrival in London, the clothes shopping scene, the alleyway fight, and Diana's marginalization and then confrontation with the British leaders. This section continues through to the meeting of the Oddfellows and also Wonder Woman's initial fights in World War I. And note that fun and games does not literally mean that it's all fun and light-hearted scenes. Fun and games is just the name for this section of the movie. If it's a horror movie, it's going to be scares in that specific setting that was promised by the premise. If it's Jurassic Park, it's going to be dinosaur attacks and escapes. If it's a mystery, this is going to be clues and leads and misdirections. If it's a family comedy, then it might actually be fun and games. And here in Wonder Woman, it's a bit of comedy and a bit of drama, with it all based on the premise of Diana now coming to learn about man's world. Recommendation, pages 35 through 64. Actualization, minutes 37 through 77. Midpoint. Dependent upon the story, this moment is when everything is great or everything is awful. It's a false victory or a false defeat. In the case of Wonder Woman, it's a false or temporary victory, comprising 2 consecutive high points: Diana saving the town of Veld, and her connecting personally with Steve. The formula places this on page 64. But Wonder Woman has it a bit later, at around minute 78. So this is a slight deviation from the formula in terms of timing, because the Wonder Woman creators went a few minutes long with their fun and games, and then they extended the midpoint to be a couple scenes and not just a single moment. The bad guys close in. In the Blockbuster formula, this means the bad guys, or the negative consequences, close in figuratively and literally. Doubt, jealousy, fear, foes regroup to defeat the main character's goal. In Wonder Woman, there's not a textbook bad guys close in section, but we do see Ludendorff and Maru's plan going forward. So you could call it a bad guys advance section. The tensions are raised between Diana and Ludendorff at the gala. Steve fails in his attempts with Maru, and then a big downward swing happens when Steve stops Diana, and they basically have a big angry separation because it comes out that Steve doesn't believe Diana. The suggestion for this is pages 65 through 87. In the film, it's minutes 86 through 100. All is lost. The opposite moment from the midpoint. So because the midpoint was a high point, this is going to be a very low point. According to Blake Snyder, it's the moment that the main character realizes they've lost everything they gained, or everything they now have has no meaning. The initial goal now looks even more impossible than before. And here, Blake Snyder suggests that to heighten the drama, you should have something or someone die. Now, a little side note for the all is lost part. In our analysis of scene 48, I talked about Wonder Woman being caught by Ares on the ground, the Oddfellows being pinned down, and Steve's death as the all is lost moment. But that was not exactly the Blake Snyder version of the all is lost moment. That was more like it looks like the hero might actually lose moment. But that was actually part of what Blake Snyder would call the finale. And there was that moment in there just to give it some extra drama. But using the definition and the beat sheet from Snyder's Save the Cat, I think it's more accurate to say that the all is lost moment is actually the gassing of Veld. That's precisely the opposite of the midpoint. Where we had seen the Veld celebration, we now see death and destruction. Where Diana was happily dancing in the snow, she is now agonized in the gas. The people of Veld who she saved are all now dead, and that gives the explicit whiff of death that Blake Snyder talked about in the all is lost moment. Also, Diana's relationship with Steve is still in a bad place, as she blames Steve for stopping her from preventing the tragedy. All is Lost is recommended for page 87. It happens here at minute 100. Dark night of the soul. The hero realizes they have nothing left. They give in to fate or faith. The main character hits bottom because you must fall completely before you can pick yourself back up and try again. Then, the moment of clarity. They realize the answer is something they learned during the B story, and they rise, preparing to synthesize what they knew at the beginning with what they've learned from the theme. For Wonder Woman, this descent into the dark night of the soul is when she angrily rides off and then kills Ludendorff. But of course that doesn't work, and she sees that the war is continuing and that men are to blame, not just Ares. The Dark Night continues for a little while into Diana's interactions with Ares, too, through the portions where she's tempted, up until she makes her decision to reject his offer. The formula says this should be 11 or 12 minutes, starting on page 87, and the film has it for about 10 or 11 minutes, from minute 100 to minute 111. Break into Act 3. This is a proactive decision by the hero to move forward. The protagonist makes a plan to synthesize his or her beginning skills with the newly acquired skills from Act 2, especially the lessons learned from the B story, and use them both to overcome the main outer conflict. So this would be Diana's explicit rejection of Ares' offer. And she doesn't yet, but she will eventually use something she learned from Act 2 in the B story, namely that it's not about deserve, it's about what you believe. The break into Act 3 is slated for page 98. In the film, it happens at about minute 111. The finale. This time around, the main character incorporates the theme, the nugget of truth that now makes sense to them, into their fight for the goal because they have experience from the A story and context from the B story. Act 3 is about synthesis. And obviously the finale in Wonder Woman is the fight with Ares. It also involves the Oddfellows trying to stop the gas bombs. We also have Steve using some lessons that he's learned and making his character decision to do something and sacrifice himself. As the formula says, Diana does learn from Steve, and it is crucial for the finale, and they bring back that lesson with repeated dialogue from the B story and the theme development. Wonder Woman has learned her lesson, she wins, and the war is over. This is suggested for pages 98 to 127, and it occurs here in minutes 111 to 127. Final image. This is the opposite of the opening image, and it's meant to prove visually that a change has occurred within the main character. So for our final image, instead of a young Diana looking down in eagerness, we have adult Diana looking up in serenity. Instead of being among the Amazons, she is now amidst a crowd in man's world. And it is clear that she has fulfilled her dream from childhood. She has had an adventure and saved mankind. And she has also learned the lessons and had her coming-of-age experience that was set up in Act 1. We also see not only changes in Diana, but changes in the world. What started in the opening shot as the beauty of Themyscira, with Amazons happily bustling in the public streets, has now been extended to man's world. The people in Trafalgar Square are celebrating, and color has returned to the world. And Diana did that. She brought peace and joy from Themyscira to man's world. Recommendation for the final image, page 127. In the film, it's minute 127. And then, as mentioned before, there's a quick epilogue after the main story of the film. And this epilogue, too, is an echo of the prologue. At the beginning, it was Paris, with Diana on the ground walking to work in civilian clothes. Now it is Paris, with Wonder Woman soaring above the city in her Wonder Woman costume, showing that, with Steve Trevor returned to her and her lessons re-inspired, she is ready to set out again as a public champion of love and compassion. So that is our beat sheet rundown of Wonder Woman, directed by Patty Jenkins. As I said before, the film follows the formula quite closely from start to finish, and that is a substantial part of why it was able to be well received on such a widespread scale by children and adults and people from many different backgrounds. And if some of you are thinking that it's somehow less desirable to have a, quote, formulaic movie than, say, a more avant-garde movie, I want to make clear that following the formula is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a formula precisely because it has proved successful in movie after movie. It is an effective way to secure buy-in to the characters and the emotions of the movie. And it makes a story palatable to an audience because they know how to process it. Following the formula is independent of inherent quality of the movie. You can have great movies that find creative and emotionally rich ways to follow the formula. Or you can have bad movies that are just uninspired and predictable as they go through the movie formula. They have characters and themes that maybe don't really work well together. Conversely, you can have movies that throw out the formula and do something completely different, and those can turn out really, really great, or they can turn out poorly. In this case, I put Wonder Woman in the category of a movie that happens to follow the formula, and it does so very effectively and with heart. And on behalf of the JLU Podcast team, thank you for listening. If you'd like more in-depth content related to DC films, then be sure to check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/JLU Podcast. If we get just a couple more patrons, then we are probably going to start up a full Man of Steel analysis. So if you're a fan of Man of Steel, then even just $1 a month can make that happen. That's at patreon.com/JLU Podcast.